You've probably seen it before, maybe even lived it yourself. Someone who's brilliant on paper, sharp, articulate, maybe a few degrees to their name. They can hold court on political theory or neuroscience or investment strategy. But when it comes to love or conflict or even a moment of vulnerability, they fall apart. Or worse, they double down on something unwise just to avoid feeling exposed. And the question naturally comes up: how can someone so smart make such dumb emotional decisions? It's easy to assume intelligence is some kind of catch-all protection, that if you're bright enough, insightful enough, rational enough, you'll somehow bypass the traps that other people fall into. But intelligence, at least the kind most often measured, is a narrow skill set. It reflects problem solving, memory, pattern recognition, abstract reasoning, and it's deeply prized in our culture. But it doesn't measure your capacity to sit with fear, or to stay grounded when someone else is hurting, or to take responsibility without spinning a story that keeps your ego intact. Some of the most intelligent people I've known, professors, engineers, leaders, have been undone by their emotional blind spots. I once worked with a colleague who could quote Heidegger in casual conversation, but who exploded when a student challenged him. He wasn't cruel. He just didn't know how to hold dissent without feeling personally threatened. That's not a failure of intellect. That's a gap in emotional development. And here's the part we often miss. Being smart can actually make emotional maturity harder to build, because it gives us tools to rationalize, to argue, to evade. It lets us name what we're doing without ever changing it. Intelligence, when left unchecked by self-awareness, becomes a very sophisticated form of avoidance. So today we're going to look at that disconnect, not from a place of judgment, but from curiosity. Why do people who can outthink a room still fall into the same emotional traps over and over again? Why does logic fall flat when we're in pain? And what does it really mean to grow, not just intellectually, but emotionally? Because the truth is, no matter how smart we are still human. And being human means we are not just thinkers, we are feelers. And sometimes we are run by things we don't even know we're feeling. That doesn't make us foolish, it makes us unfinished. And that's where the real work begins.
Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
Here's something we don't say often enough. Being intellectually gifted doesn't mean you're fully equipped for life. We live in a world that tends to equate intelligence with worth. From the time we're young, being smart is praised, rewarded, and held up as a shield against life's difficulties. If you're clever enough, if you score high enough, if you argue well enough, the assumption is that you'll make good decisions, because why wouldn't you? But intelligence, in the traditional sense, is only one thread in the fabric of human functioning. Psychologists often talk about cognitive intelligence, or IQ, as a measure of reasoning, memory, problem solving, things you can test on paper, but emotional intelligence is something else entirely. It's subtle, harder to quantify, and often more predictive of relational success, leadership ability, and life satisfaction. Daniel Goleman helped bring the term emotional intelligence, or EQ, into popular awareness in the 1990s. But even before that, Thinkers like Howard Gardner were challenging the idea that there's only one kind of intelligence. Emotional intelligence includes self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skill. And here's the kicker: none of those things require a high IQ. In fact, sometimes a high IQ can get in the way because what intelligence often enables is explanation. An explanation can quickly become a defense mechanism. We can describe our feelings with great accuracy, sometimes even elegance, while remaining completely disconnected from them. You've probably heard someone do this. They say something like, "I know I have abandonment issues, and that's probably why I keep dating unavailable people," and they sound so insightful that no one notices they're still in the same painful pattern. Naming isn't the same as transforming. Understanding isn't the same as emotional agility. There's a psychological construct called alexithymia. It refers to a difficulty in identifying and describing emotions. And while it's often studied in clinical settings, a milder version of it shows up all the time among high-functioning adults. People who excel in logic-based domains often weren't raised to value emotional fluency. They may be praised for being stoic, independent, or rational, but discouraged from showing vulnerability. So they grow up thinking emotions are problems to solve, not experiences to feel. I once taught a student, let's call him Max, who had a mind like a steel trap. He could parse out dense philosophical texts, cross-reference studies without missing a beat, and write analytical essays that would impress any review board. But one day in class, when we were discussing grief theory, he went quiet. Afterward, he stopped by my office and said, "I think I might be sad about my grandmother, but I'm not sure. I just feel off. Maybe I'm tired." That kind of emotional confusion is more common than we realize, especially in people who've been trained to live in their heads. For many, the language of emotion is like a second language they never learned. And so, when a moment of emotional intensity hits, a breakup, a betrayal, a disappointment, they try to think their way through it. But the emotional body doesn't respond to logic. It responds to presence. And presence is something intelligence alone can't guarantee. None of this means intelligence is the enemy. Quite the opposite. It's a gift. But like any gift, it needs guidance. If you build a life on intellect alone, you may find yourself able to win debates and still lose relationships. You may predict outcomes, but miss the nuances of human connection. You may be able to solve equations, but not know how to sit with someone's pain, or your own. Emotional intelligence isn't about being soft. It's about being whole. And being whole means developing the parts of ourselves that school, status, and even success may have overlooked. One of the most seductive things about being smart is the belief that understanding equals control. If I can name it, I can manage it. If I can predict it, I can prevent it. If I can analyze it, I can fix it. This mindset works beautifully in certain environments: science labs, policy think tanks, legal arguments. But when it comes to emotion, it falls apart. Feelings don't operate on clean logic. They don't wait their turn. They don't respond to intellectual persuasion. You can know something isn't rational and still feel it with your whole chest. You can tell yourself not to care, not to hope, not to grieve, and still find your stomach in knots or your sleep interrupted at 3 in the morning. Emotion doesn't take direction from cognition. It takes its cues from memory, from physiology, from lived experience, from longing, and from fear. This is where the concept of locus of control comes into play. Julian Rotter introduced the idea in the 1960s, describing how people differ in the degree to which they believe they control the events in their lives. Someone with a strong internal locus of control tends to believe that outcomes are shaped by their own actions. Someone with an external locus tends to believe that forces outside them, luck, fate, other people, determine what happens. For intelligent, driven people, a strong internal locus can be empowering. It fuels persistence and resilience. But it also sets the stage for a subtle, dangerous belief that if something goes wrong emotionally, it must be because I didn't think it through well enough. I didn't prepare. I didn't spot the signs. I missed something. In other words, if I suffer, it must be a failure of analysis. Human relationships aren't math problems. They can't be solved, only experienced. No matter how careful you are, you will misunderstand people. You will be misunderstood. You will trust the wrong person, say the wrong thing, hold on too long, or walk away too soon. That isn't a flaw in your logic. That's what it means to be emotionally alive. Our brains process information through two basic modes. One is quick, intuitive, and emotional. The other is slower, more deliberate and analytical. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, talks about this in his work on dual process theory. He describes two systems of thinking. System 1 is fast, automatic, emotional. System 2 is slow, deliberate, analytical. Most smart people rely heavily on System 2. It's the one that helps them perform well in school, at work, in structured decision-making. But emotional life? That's mostly governed by System 1. It's immediate. It's based on pattern recognition, gut reactions, memory traces. And trying to outthink System 1 with System 2 often backfires. This is why someone can say, I knew it was a bad idea, but I did it anyway. Or, I told myself I was fine, but I kept crying in the car. The emotional brain speaks its own language, and no amount of IQ can translate it if we refuse to listen. We aren't rational creatures who feel. We're emotional creatures who sometimes manage to think. That doesn't make us weak. It makes us real. The illusion of control is comforting, but it keeps us from developing something much more useful: emotional flexibility, the ability to stay with what is rather than try to control what should be. Let's talk about emotional immaturity in high places, or in high-status positions. If you've ever worked in an environment where someone with enormous status, power, or intellectual prestige routinely behaves like an emotional adolescent, you're not alone. It's disorienting, isn't it? To see someone who commands a boardroom or delivers brilliant lectures fall apart over a scheduling change, or retaliate after receiving constructive feedback, or withdraw completely when interpersonal tension arises. One of the most important truths we can hold as adults is that success doesn't guarantee maturity. In fact, for many high-achieving individuals, emotional growth is the piece that gets left behind. It's the one that doesn't get them accolades, doesn't lead to promotions, doesn't show up in a resume summary or on a plaque. And yet, its absence shows up everywhere else. Emotional immaturity can look like reactivity, avoidance, defensiveness, a chronic need to be right, an inability to self-soothe, or a tendency to blame others when things don't go well. None of these behaviors require a lack of intelligence. In fact, the most emotionally immature people can often cloak their behavior in language that sounds just intellectual enough to pass. I was simply exercising boundaries. I don't engage with low-vibration energy. I'm not avoiding conflict, I just don't see the point in indulging drama. But what they're really doing is using sophistication to shield immaturity. This is what psychologists refer to as compartmentalization, a defense mechanism that allows someone to separate parts of their life so they don't have to confront inner contradictions. It's how a person can be disciplined and thoughtful in one area, yet emotionally explosive or completely unavailable in another. The brain keeps these parts of the self in different drawers, and as long as the drawers stay closed, they never have to reckon with the inconsistency. But that inconsistency is exactly what others feel. You might have a professor who is brilliant in front of a lecture hall, but terrifying in meetings, or a physician who's masterful with data but dismissive of emotional nuance, or a senior executive who can craft visionary strategy but takes every disagreement as a personal attack. These patterns are more than personality quirks. They're signals, indicators that emotional development didn't keep pace with cognitive advancement. It's not always malice or narcissism. Sometimes it's simply neglect. Emotional intelligence isn't a byproduct of age or IQ. It requires attention, effort, humility, and above all, practice. If someone never learned how to navigate emotions safely, their brain will default to what it knows, intellectualizing, denying, escaping, or overpowering. And here's where it gets personal, because it's not just about those other people in positions of power. It's about us, all of us. Every person listening has some area of their life where they're more developed than others. And for those who've spent their lives relying on intellect to solve problems, the emotional realm can feel chaotic, disordered, even threatening. So we fall back on what we know. We think harder, work faster, stay busier, or we distance ourselves from the emotional mess entirely. But distance doesn't protect us, it isolates us. The real work is not about getting smarter, it's about getting steadier, and that means learning to meet emotional discomfort without reaching for the escape hatch. There comes a point when analysis becomes avoidance. There's a peculiar skill that highly intelligent people often develop without meaning to. They become masterful at explaining their emotions without ever truly feeling them. It sounds like self-awareness. It looks like insight. But it's really just distance, a kind of clean, clinical dissection of pain that allows them to avoid actually experiencing it. This is what I mean when I say that analysis becomes avoidance. I've seen this most often in high-functioning environments, universities, research institutions, legal circles, think tanks, where the culture rewards emotional distance. You're praised for objectivity, for reason, for the ability to hold firm in the face of conflict or uncertainty. But what's quietly discouraged, or even pathologized, is emotion, especially the kind that isn't tidy, especially the kind that makes people uncomfortable. So instead of feeling, we explain. Instead of saying, "I'm deeply sad," we say, "I think I'm experiencing some emotional residue tied to a prior attachment pattern." Instead of admitting, "I'm hurt," we say, "It's fascinating how quickly this dynamic echoes early formative experiences." And we don't just talk like this to others, we talk like this to ourselves. We become so adept at observing our inner world that we forget how to inhabit it. The term emotional bypassing isn't a clinical diagnosis, but it captures something real. It refers to the tendency to sidestep emotional experience by moving quickly into interpretation or abstraction. Sometimes people use spiritual language to do this. It's all happening for a reason. But in academic and professional circles, it's analysis that does the heavy lifting. The more articulate we are, the easier it is to rationalize our emotional avoidance as a kind of evolved perspective. But the brain doesn't work that way. Emotional processing doesn't happen in the language centers. It happens primarily in the limbic system, the seat of emotion, memory, and instinct. And when we try to stay in the cognitive space alone, what we're really doing is trying to bypass our biology. It doesn't work. We may sound composed, but the body still remembers. Tension lingers, sleep suffers, focus wanders. Emotions that aren't metabolized don't disappear. They calcify, hardening into patterns of tension, anxiety, or numbness. Or they find other ways out, often through irritability, withdrawal, or disproportionate reactions to minor stressors. I remember speaking with a former student, a gifted thinker, who once said to me, "I don't know how to stop spinning. Every time I feel something, I end up researching it. I don't know how to just let it be true." That's the heart of it, isn't it? The fear that if we stop analyzing, we'll lose control, that the feeling will overwhelm us, or change us, or undo something we've carefully built. But more often, the opposite is true. When we stop analyzing and actually allow the feeling to move through, it softens. It shifts. It does what emotion is meant to do. It communicates. We are not meant to explain every feeling. We are meant to feel it. And when we do, we start to build something more powerful than insight. We build capacity. And capacity is what allows us to live, not just understand our lives from a distance. So what does emotional maturity look like, and why is it so rare? There's a kind of strength that doesn't get much applause. It doesn't come with titles or trophies. You don't get promoted for it, and it won't raise your IQ. But it changes everything. It's the strength to pause in the middle of discomfort, to take responsibility without defensiveness, to regulate your emotions without repressing them. That's what emotional maturity is. And despite how rare it is, it's not mysterious. Emotional maturity looks like staying in the conversation even when you're uncomfortable. It means not making your feelings someone else's fault, but also not pretending they don't exist. It means allowing space for another person's truth without needing to immediately defend your own. And it often means knowing how to repair when you've caused harm, not by explaining your intent, but by listening to your impact. This is difficult for anyone, but it's uniquely difficult for people who've built their identity around being smart. Because emotional maturity requires you to do something the ego resists. It asks you to not have the answer, to be quiet inside, to sit with uncertainty, to stay grounded when you don't like how something feels. These aren't traits we associate with intelligence, but maybe we should. One of the most underappreciated theories in psychology is Carol Dweck's work on fixed versus growth mindsets. A fixed mindset says, this is who I am, this is what I'm good at, and if I fail, it means I'm not enough. A growth mindset says, I can change, I can learn, and failure is part of that process. We usually apply this theory to academics or achievement, but it's just as important in emotional life. People with a fixed mindset around emotions tend to say things like, I'm just not good with feelings, or I'm not a relationship person, or I'm too analytical to do vulnerability. They treat emotional capacity as if it were a static trait, something you either have or you don't. But it isn't. Emotional maturity is a practice. It's not about being unshakable. It's about learning how to recover, how to reflect, how to respond instead of react. And often the people who've had the least practice are those who were praised for intellect from an early age. If you were told you were the smart one, you might have learned to rely on cognition while neglecting the emotional body. You may have gotten attention for composure, for performance, for quick thinking, but not for openness, softness, or depth. So those muscles didn't develop, but they can. That's the quiet beauty of it. Emotional maturity doesn't arrive all at once. It's grown, slowly, through lived experience. It's built every time you resist the urge to deflect, every time you admit you're hurt instead of lashing out, every time you allow yourself to feel without immediately needing to fix. And here's the part I find most meaningful. You don't have to trade your intellect to become emotionally mature. You don't have to be less sharp, less insightful, less rigorous. What you gain, instead, is the ability to use that brilliance in service of connection. You become more attuned, not less. More capable, not more fragile. Because the real goal isn't to be ruled by intellect or overrun by emotion. The real goal is integration, head and heart working together. And that's not a contradiction. That's what it means to be fully human. So now let's talk about how to bring the head and heart together. There's a moment in many people's lives, sometimes quiet, sometimes dramatic, when they realize that knowing better hasn't been enough. That all the books, the strategies, the clever rationalizations haven't protected them from heartache, confusion, or regret. that their intellect, as sharp and finely tuned as it may be, hasn't insulated them from the deeper, more tender parts of being human. And it's in that moment often that real growth begins. Because wisdom doesn't come from intelligence alone, it comes from integration, from allowing the mind to illuminate but not dominate, from recognizing that clarity isn't just a cognitive achievement, it's an emotional orientation. It's the ability to see things as they are, not just as you've trained yourself to interpret them. So, what does it look like to bring the head and heart together? It means allowing yourself to feel without losing your footing. It means using your insight not to escape your emotions, but to name them more precisely. It means knowing the difference between explanation and responsibility, between processing and presence. It also means acknowledging that brilliance and emotional clumsiness can coexist. And that doesn't make you a fraud. It makes you a person in progress, someone who's brave enough to examine not just what they know, but how they live. I think of a former student, someone deeply gifted, who once told me that they used to believe they were above drama, above emotional chaos, above being affected. They believed that being unaffected was a sign of strength. But over time, what they realized was that detachment had become a disguise, not for peace, but for fear. They were terrified to be moved, to be changed, to be vulnerable. And when they finally allowed themselves to break that wall, to let a little of the world in, they didn't become weaker. They became kinder, softer, more whole. The truth is, emotional maturity doesn't subtract from your intelligence, it rounds it out. And while it begins as a practice, it becomes a posture, a way of meeting the world that's rooted, present, and responsive. It gives it dimension. Without it, intelligence can be brittle, cold, detached. But with it, intelligence becomes wisdom. It becomes compassion. It becomes a force that doesn't just inform the world, but heals it. So wherever you are right now, whether you're someone who's always been praised for being smart or someone who's struggled to feel emotionally steady, there's room for growth. Not by abandoning what you know, but by expanding how you feel what you know. Because you are not just a mind, you are a mind with a body that remembers, that responds, that feels. When you stop trying to outthink that body, when you begin to truly listen, you don't lose your edge. You find your wholeness. And in doing so, you begin to live not just intelligently, but fully.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.